The mysterious signal. The stars shimmered in the vast emptiness of space, and the old space station, Vanguard 12, floated silently above the gas giant below. It wasn't much to look at, a rusted collection of metal and forgotten technology. Once, it had been a bustling refueling station for travelers passing through the sector. Now, it was little more than a forgotten outpost with a skeleton crew of 6. Captain Daniel Reed stood at the observation window, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes scanned the darkness. Nothing but the usual. Asteroids, faint stars, and the pale green glow of the gas giant beneath them. It was just another quiet, uneventful day. "Captain, I think you should see this," came the voice of Lieutenant Mara Greaves, the station's communications officer. Reed sighed and turned. "What is it now, Mara?" "Another solar flare report." Mara didn't answer immediately, which made him pause. She stared at her console, adjusting the controls with a furrowed brow. "It's a distress signal, sir," she said, finally looking up at him. "But it's strange." Reed's interest sharpened. Distress signals weren't common in this sector. Space travel was well monitored, and accidents rarely happened this far from the central routes. "Patch it through," he ordered, walking over to her station. Mara nodded, and static filled the room. A faint voice crackled through the speakers, distorted and barely audible. "Mayday. Unknown vessel. Coordinates. Critical failure. Assistance required." Then silence. "Where's it coming from?" Reed asked, leaning over her shoulder. Mara tapped the screen, pulling up the location. "Coordinates show it's about 200,000 kilometers from here, just outside the mapped region." Reed exchanged a glance with Chief Engineer Malcolm Kane, who had been listening quietly nearby. "That's deep space," Kane said. "There's nothing out there. No colonies, no stations, just emptiness." Reed nodded. "That's what made it strange. Could be a derelict ship. Might have been drifting for years," he suggested. "Or it could be a trap," Mara added, narrowing her eyes. Reed considered that. Space pirates weren't unheard of, though rare this far from populated systems. "Run a diagnostic on the signal," he said. "See if you can trace the origin or find out how old it is." Mara got to work, fingers flying over the controls. The room fell into a quiet hum, the distant drone of the station's engines filling the silence. After a few moments, Mara shook her head. "The signal's fresh, maybe a few hours old at most. There's something else." She hesitated. "Go on," Reed prompted. "I'm picking up strange interference, like something's piggybacking on the signal. It's faint, but there's definitely something else there." Reed frowned. That didn't sit right. "Bring up the visual feed from the long-range scanners," he said. A holographic projection flickered to life above the control panel. The sensors showed a faint blip where the signal had originated, nothing more than a drifting object. But as Reed stared closer, something shifted. For just a moment, there was a second shape, ghostly, faint, and then gone. Kane stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "Did anyone else see that?" Mara nodded slowly. "Yeah, I saw it." Reed's hand hovered over the console. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down. They could ignore the signal and continue their quiet, uneventful shift, or they could investigate. "What's your call, Captain?" Kane asked. Reed took a breath. "We're close enough. Let's check it out. Prep the shuttle, and get the away team ready. I want eyes on that ship in 1 hour." Mara didn't look convinced, but she nodded and relayed the orders. Kane left to ready the engineering crew. Reed stayed behind for a moment, staring at the dark expanse of space beyond the window. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching them. 1 hour later, the shuttle drifted through the emptiness, its engines quiet as it approached the signal's origin. Reed piloted the craft with Kane and Mara seated behind him. The others remained on the station, monitoring from a distance. The derelict ship appeared on the horizon, a dark, jagged silhouette against the stars. It was larger than Reed expected, shaped like no vessel he'd ever seen before. As they drew closer, lights flickered along the ship's exterior. "That ship's activating," Mara whispered. "That shouldn't be possible," Kane muttered. Suddenly, the shuttle's lights flickered, and the consoles blinked out for a split second. "What the—" Reed began, but the ship vanished from the scanners. Gone, as if it had never been there. But just before it disappeared, a single shape appeared on the shuttle's internal scanner. Something was moving inside the ship, and it was watching them. The derelict vessel. The silence inside the shuttle felt heavier than the emptiness of space outside. Captain Reed's hands gripped the controls tighter than he realized as the derelict vessel came into clearer view. The ship loomed like a sleeping giant, its hull covered in strange, jagged patterns that reflected faint light from distant stars. Lieutenant Mara Greaves leaned forward, eyes fixed on the display. "That design. It doesn't match anything in our database. I don't think this is one of ours." Reed didn't respond immediately. He felt it too, the creeping unease that came with staring at something not meant to be found. Kane shifted in his seat, squinting at the holographic scan of the ship. "It's old," he said. "Judging by the wear and the pitted hull, I'd say this thing has been out here for decades, maybe longer." "Then why does it still have power?" Mara asked, her voice quiet but sharp. Reed adjusted the shuttle's approach, circling the ship's exterior. The vessel was massive, far larger than he initially thought. Its surface was marked by deep grooves and scars, as if it had survived countless battles. No insignia, no identifying features, just a husk drifting alone in deep space. "There," Kane pointed. "Docking port. Looks intact." Reed guided the shuttle toward the port, and as they neared, a low vibration trembled through the ship's frame. "Hold on," Reed said, pulling the shuttle back slightly. "I didn't touch anything." Mara stared at her console. "The ship, it's linking with us." "What do you mean linking?" Kane asked, leaning over to look at her screen. "I mean the docking clamps just engaged, by themselves." Reed's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. The clamps extended from the derelict, locking onto the shuttle with a metallic thud. He tapped the controls to disengage, but nothing happened. "We're locked in," Mara confirmed, glancing nervously at Reed. Reed took a slow breath. "All right. We came this far. We go in." Kane didn't argue. He was already strapping on his equipment pack. Mara hesitated for a moment but followed suit. Minutes later, the airlock hissed open, releasing a thin mist as the shuttle's ramp extended onto the alien vessel. Reed stepped forward first, the magnetic clamps on his boots clicking against the ship's floor. The corridor beyond the airlock stretched into the shadows, dimly lit by flickering strips of light along the ceiling. Kane's voice echoed behind him. "I thought this ship was dead." "So did I," Reed replied. Mara ran her hand along the wall as she walked. The surface felt smooth but strange, almost organic. "It's warm," she said quietly. Reed stopped and turned. "Warm?" Mara nodded, pulling her hand away as if the surface might burn her. "Barely. But it shouldn't be. Not in space." Reed motioned for them to keep moving. The corridor twisted and branched like a maze, but something about the design felt deliberate. "This wasn't built by humans," Kane said, his voice firm. "I've worked on every class of ship in the fleet. Nothing looks like this." Reed agreed. The architecture felt alien, curved, fluid, like the ship had grown rather than been constructed. As they rounded a corner, the corridor opened into a large chamber. The room's center held a circular platform with what looked like a control console at its core. Strange symbols glowed faintly on its surface, pulsating with a rhythm that felt alive. Mara stepped closer but didn't touch it. "Captain, this looks like a navigation system. Maybe we can find out where this ship has been." Kane glanced around the chamber. "I'd rather know who was flying it first." Reed activated his scanner, sweeping the room. "No life signs," he reported, though he didn't feel reassured. Mara leaned over the console, tapping her wrist device to interface with the system. The screen flashed, and a string of unreadable symbols filled the display. "I can try to translate, but it'll take time," she said. Reed nodded. "Start with whatever you can. We'll check the rest of the ship." Deeper inside, the corridors stretched endlessly as the trio moved deeper. Dust floated in the air, disturbed only by their movements. Kane stopped suddenly, his flashlight beam catching something on the far wall. "Captain, over here," he called. Reed approached, and his breath caught in his throat. The wall wasn't empty. It was lined with rows of dark, glass-like pods. Inside each pod, faint shadows shifted, as if something was sealed within. "What the hell is this?" Kane whispered, pressing his hand to the glass. Before Reed could respond, one of the pods flickered with faint blue light. The shadow inside shifted slightly, and for a moment, Reed swore he saw eyes staring back at him. "Step back," Reed ordered, gripping Kane's shoulder. As they retreated, the ship's lights dimmed suddenly. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls. Mara's voice crackled over the comm. "Captain, you need to see this." Reed and Kane rushed back to the chamber where she had stayed behind. Mara stood at the console, her face pale. "I accessed the logs," she said. "This ship, it's a prison transport." Reed's brow furrowed. "A prison for what?" Mara swallowed hard. "I'm not sure, but the logs mentioned containment breaches." Before Reed could process her words, a loud clang echoed through the corridor behind them. One of the pods had opened. Something was awake, awakening the enemy. The clang echoed down the dark corridor, lingering far longer than it should have. Captain Reed's eyes locked with Lieutenant Mara Greaves, both silently asking the same question. What just came out of that pod? Kane, gripping his plasma cutter tightly, slowly took a step back toward the entrance. "That wasn't just machinery creaking," he muttered, voice low but tense. "Something's moving." Reed nodded. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, but they had come too far. "Stay calm. We don't know if it's hostile yet." Yet, the word hung heavily in the air. The ship's atmosphere seemed to grow heavier as they moved carefully toward the pod chamber. Reed's heart thudded in his ears as the trio stepped back into the long corridor lined with the strange glass pods. One of them was open. The glass lay shattered across the floor, fragments glittering under the faint, flickering light. The pod's occupant, whatever it was gone. Mara scanned the area, her trembling hand gripping the device like a lifeline. "No life signs," she whispered. Kane wasn't convinced. "That thing came out of this pod. It's still here. Scanners can't detect everything." Reed knelt, running his gloved hand along the shards of glass. The edges were slick with a viscous, greenish fluid that trailed away from the pod in long streaks, leading deeper into the ship. "Tracks," Reed said quietly. "Whatever was in here, it's injured or leaking." Mara swallowed. "That doesn't make me feel any better, Captain." "It shouldn't," Kane replied. Reed rose to his feet and motioned for them to follow the trail. His grip tightened on the sidearm strapped to his belt. The soft thud of their boots echoed down the empty corridor as they proceeded slowly, listening for the slightest sound. The forgotten passage. The trail led them down a passage that wasn't on the station's original schematics Mara had pulled earlier. The walls felt different, organic, almost as if the ship itself had grown this part like an extension. "Captain," Mara said, hesitating. "This corridor wasn't here when I scanned the ship." Reed glanced around. "Maybe the ship's shifting itself." "Kane, mark our path. I don't want to get trapped down here." Kane placed small locator beacons along the wall at regular intervals. Their blinking lights were a small comfort in the consuming shadows. The trail led to a set of heavy blast doors, sealed tightly with thick black cables snaking along their surface. The markings above the door pulsed faintly, symbols none of them could read. Reed reached out, his hand hovering over the door's surface. As if sensing his presence, the cables began to unwind, slithering back into the walls. Mara's eyes widened. That's not normal. Ships aren't supposed to do that. The doors hissed open, revealing the chamber beyond. The core room. Reed stepped inside cautiously, his light scanning the room. The chamber was massive, circular, and filled with humming machinery that spiraled up toward the ceiling. At the center stood a towering glass cylinder, dimly illuminated from within. Inside the cylinder was a figure. Reed stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was humanoid, tall, lean, with pale, translucent skin stretched tightly over its bones. Strange, jagged armor was fused to its body, and dark cables extended from its spine into the walls around the chamber. Its head tilted slightly, eyes closed, as it's sleeping. "Is that a prisoner?" Kane whispered. Mara shook her head, stepping forward with her scanner. "I don't know. I'm picking up faint brain activity, but it's different." Before Reed could respond, the lights in the room flickered violently. The machinery groaned, and the figure's eyes snapped open. Two glowing violet orbs stared directly at Reed. The being's head twitched unnaturally to one side, and the cables holding it began retracting, releasing the creature from the cylinder with a loud metallic screech. "Back away," Reed ordered, raising his weapon. "Mara, get the shuttle ready to launch." Mara frantically tapped her comlink, but static filled her earpiece. "Something's blocking communications." The creature stepped forward, each movement slow and deliberate. Its eyes narrowed as it studied them, as if deciding whether they were threats or prey. Kane leveled his plasma cutter at the figure. "Don't move," he barked. The creature's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Instead, it raised one clawed hand and pointed directly at Mara. She froze. "Captain." Before Reed could react, the lights surged, blinding them for a split second. When their vision cleared, the creature was gone. "What? Where did it go?" Kane spun around, searching the chamber. Reed's gut twisted. "It's still on the ship. Let's get out of here. Now." The descent into chaos. As they hurried back toward the shuttle, the once quiet corridors began to hum with new energy. The ship's walls rippled slightly, as if coming alive. The pods they passed flickered, and for a moment, Reed swore he saw movement within them. Mara glanced nervously at Kane. "I think we woke up more than one thing." Kane's voice was grim. "Yeah, I think we did too." They reached the shuttle bay, only to find the docking clamps were re-engaged, this time sealed tight. Mara furiously worked the console. "It's not responding. I can't unlock it." Reed cursed under his breath. The faint sensation of being watched crept over him again, and then from the shadows of the bay, two glowing violet eyes emerged. The creature had followed them, and this time it wasn't alone. The hidden message. The shuttle's interior lights flickered erratically as Captain Reed slammed his fist against the control panel. The docking clamps refused to disengage, locking them to the derelict vessel like a spider clutching its prey. Kane kept his plasma cutter aimed at the corridor's entrance, where those violet eyes had faded into the shadows moments earlier. "Captain, whatever that thing is, it's not leaving us alone." Mara's fingers danced across the console, frustration tightening her jaw. "I've tried everything. It's like the ship is overriding the system. The clamps aren't mechanical. They're biological." "Biological," Reed echoed, stepping toward her. Mara didn't look up. "The cables keeping us here, they're part of the ship. This whole vessel isn't just a machine. It's alive, or at least partially." A heavy silence filled the shuttle. Kane broke it with a nervous laugh. "Great, we're parked on a haunted space whale." But no one else was laughing. Reed narrowed his eyes, stepping away from the control panel. "We need another way out. We can't just sit here waiting to be hunted." Mara hesitated. "There might be a way. When I accessed the navigation console earlier, I downloaded some of the ship's encrypted data. I didn't get much, but I noticed repeating symbols, like a coded warning. If I can decrypt it, maybe we'll learn more about what we're dealing with. Kane shook his head. Captain, I don't think cracking alien puzzles is going to save us. That thing is still out there. Reed exhaled slowly, weighing the options. They could try to fight their way off the ship, or unlock the secrets it held. We're not going anywhere unless we understand what this ship is, Reed decided. Mara, decrypt that data. Kane, secure the entrance. We buy ourselves time. The forgotten logs. Mara sat cross-legged on the shuttle floor, her datapad resting on her lap. Strange symbols glowed faintly on the screen, looping in patterns that seemed almost musical. She worked in silence, letting the hum of the derelict vessel fade into the background. Reed paced nearby, occasionally glancing at the pod chamber beyond the shuttle's glass viewport. The shattered pod still glistened with that strange green fluid, but there were no new signs of movement. Kane stood guard, weapon ready. His eyes never left the entrance. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, Mara exhaled sharply. I've got something, she announced, standing. Reed and Kane gathered around as she held the datapad between them. It's not a full translation, but enough to get the general message. The display showed a series of crude humanoid figures, surrounded by smaller markings that glowed faintly. This ship isn't just a prison, Mara said quietly. It's a quarantine vessel. The crew that operated this thing, whoever they were, found something dangerous. Something they couldn't destroy, so they sealed it here. This vessel was designed to drift indefinitely. Reed's eyes darkened. And now we've woken it up. Kane exhaled through clenched teeth. Why am I not surprised? Mara tapped the screen again, showing another set of symbols. There's more. The warnings mention containment layers. The pods were the first. But if the core chamber opens... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Reed's mind raced. The creature wasn't just some forgotten relic. It was part of something far larger. And it wasn't alone. The echo of footsteps. A soft sound echoed from the corridor beyond the shuttle. Kane's hand immediately shot to his plasma cutter, raising it toward the sound. Did you hear that? Kane hissed. Reed did. It was faint, like footsteps. Not heavy, but deliberate. It's close, Mara whispered. Reed flicked his comm on. Station crew, do you read me? We've got a situation. Static. They're jamming our signals again, Mara said. Reed's eyes locked with Kane's. We're being hunted. Kane's jaw tightened. So what's the play, Captain? We can't shoot what we can't see. Before Reed could respond, the shuttle's internal lights dimmed. A low vibration hummed beneath their feet. The derelict ship was reacting to their presence, like a body rejecting a foreign object. We don't have much time, Mara said urgently. The logs mention a failsafe. If the ship detects contamination, it seals itself permanently. We'll be trapped here. Reed clenched his fist. How do we stop it? Mara hesitated. There's a manual override in the control core, but it's risky. If we trigger it, the ship might see us as threats. We're already threats, Kane muttered. Reed nodded. We head to the core. If this thing is waking up, we shut it down before it seals us inside. Descent into the core. The corridor to the core chamber twisted unnaturally, as if the ship itself was shifting. Kane marked their path again, but the beacons flickered uncertainly, as though struggling to maintain their connection. Reed led the way, his sidearm raised. Mara followed, gripping her datapad like a lifeline. Kane brought up the rear, scanning every shadow. The closer they got to the core, the thicker the air felt. It wasn't just stale. Something about the atmosphere felt heavy, charged with static. Finally, they reached the chamber. The door leading inside was sealed tight, wrapped in the same black cables they had seen earlier. But these were different, pulsing, alive. Mara approached carefully, raising her hand to the cables. I can interface with this, she said, pressing her datapad to the surface. As soon as she touched it, the cables writhed violently. Kane yanked her back. Easy. Reed barked. The cables settled, but the chamber door groaned open. And there, standing inside the room, was the figure from before. It wasn't alone. Race against time. The court chamber was bathed in a dim, pulsating blue light, casting long shadows across the twisted walls. Captain Reed's grip tightened on his sidearm as his eyes adjusted to the strange sight before him. The figure from the pod, the tall, pale humanoid with those glowing violet eyes, stood perfectly still at the far side of the chamber. It wasn't alone. Behind it, half a dozen more figures lined the walls, their pods cracked open, dark cables slithering back into the ship's surfaces like retracting tendrils. Each of them shared the same translucent skin and biomechanical armor, standing silently like statues awaiting orders. Kane exhaled slowly, raising his plasma cutter. Captain, I'm starting to think we missed the part where we should have run. Reed didn't disagree. Mara stepped closer, her datapad trembling in her hands. They aren't moving, she whispered. Why aren't they attacking? Reed took a cautious step forward, keeping his weapon trained on the closest figure. Its glowing eyes followed him but made no other movements. They're waiting for something, Reed muttered. Or someone. Mara began scanning the room. The control console stood in the center, circular with alien symbols etched across its surface, flickering faintly as if responding to their presence. We need to activate the override, Mara said. The logs mentioned it can stop the containment protocol if we engage it manually. But I have no idea what happens after. Kane kept his eyes fixed on the figures. I'm guessing it won't be good. Let's not give them a reason to wake up, Reed said, motioning for Mara to proceed. Get the override ready. As Mara approached the console, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Her fingers hovered over the controls, sweat dripping down her brow. Each touch of the alien symbols sent a ripple of light across the chamber walls, illuminating the figures standing in the shadows. They're reacting, Kane muttered. Mara's breathing grew heavier. I'm almost through. Reed's gaze flickered to the nearest figure. Its violet eyes blinked once. Slowly, deliberately. Then the lights across the room flared, and the figures took their first steps forward. Captain. Kane's voice dropped, brimming with tension. I see them, Reed replied, voice calm but firm. Mara, whatever you're doing, do it faster. The first figure stepped toward them, slow and unsteady, as if regaining strength after a long hibernation. Reed raised his sidearm, training it on the figure's chest. Don't come any closer. The figure paused, but only for a second. It took another step, tilting its head as though curious. Reed fired. The plasma round struck the figure dead center, sending a shockwave rippling across its body. The force staggered it briefly, but as the smoke cleared, Reed's heart sank. The shot left no visible damage. They're armored, Kane said grimly. Weapons won't cut it. Before Reed could respond, the other figures began advancing, their movements faster, more fluid. Mara, we're running out of time. Reed barked. I know, just a little more. The chamber trembled violently. The ship itself groaned, as if aware of the intrusion. Suddenly, the figures halted. One of them raised its hand toward Mara. Mara, step back, Reed shouted. Before she could react, the control panel beneath her sparked, and a surge of energy shot through the console. The force threw her backward, slamming her into the floor. Kane rushed to her side, pulling her away as smoke billowed from the controls. Mara, are you all right? Kane asked, shaking her. She groaned, clutching her side. I'm fine. But the console. The alien figures watched them silently. The glow in their eyes seemed to intensify. Reed's stomach tightened. They weren't trying to kill us, he said aloud. They were trying to stop us from overriding the system. Mara looked up in disbelief. They want the ship sealed. They don't want to escape. Kane frowned. Why the hell not? Reed's eyes darkened. Because they're not the ones we need to worry about. As if on cue, a deafening crack echoed through the chamber. The central column in the room, a larger pod hidden in the shadows, began to split open. Dark mist poured from its seams, pooling along the floor. The violet-eyed figures retreated, backing away from the pod like soldiers recognizing the return of their commanding officer. Kane's face paled. What is that? The mist swirled, and from within the pod, a massive shape emerged. It was unlike the other figures, taller, broader, with jagged armor fused directly into its skeletal frame. Its skin pulsed with faint energy, and glowing veins crisscrossed its chest like circuitry. Its eyes, however, were not violet. They burned red. Mara stumbled to her feet, backing away. Captain, that thing. It's different. Reed aimed his weapon at the entity. He didn't lower it, even though deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. Different or not, Reed said coldly, we're not dying here today. The entity's head turned toward them, red eyes narrowing. It stepped forward, and the entire ship began to shake. Betrayal and revelation. The red-eyed entity towered over the chamber, its heavy footsteps echoing like distant thunder. Captain Reed's pulse quickened as he locked eyes with it, but he didn't lower his weapon. The pale, violet-eyed figures that had once seemed so threatening now stood at the edges of the room, unmoving, almost as if they feared the being that had just emerged. Kane kept his plasma cutter aimed at the creature, shifting nervously. Captain, I've seen a lot of weird things in deep space, but this is something else. Reed nodded grimly. Stay sharp. We don't know its intentions yet. Mara, still clutching her ribs from the earlier blast, carefully stepped forward. Her voice trembled slightly, but curiosity burned in her eyes. Captain, look at the symbols on its armor. Reed glanced at the being's chest plate. Strange alien runes glowed faintly across the surface, pulsing in sync with the veins running beneath its skin. But there was something else, a familiar emblem etched across its shoulder. Reed's heart skipped. That's human, he muttered under his breath. Kane squinted, stepping closer. You're right. That's the insignia of the old Earth Defense Fleet. But that can't be. Before he could finish, the entity shifted, its gaze narrowing on Reed. Who are you? The creature's voice echoed, not through sound, but directly into their minds. Reed stiffened, feeling the words resonate deep in his skull. Kane visibly recoiled, shaking his head as if to clear the sensation. We're explorers, Reed replied cautiously. We received a distress signal and found this ship adrift. We mean no harm. The entity's eyes flickered. It stepped closer, its movements precise yet unnaturally smooth, as if gravity held no true power over it. Explorers, or scavengers? It asked, its voice calm but laced with something darker. We're not here to scavenge, Reed insisted. We came to help. The red glow of the creature's eyes dimmed slightly, and for a brief moment, Reed thought they had diffused the situation. But then the entity's gaze shifted to Mara. You tried to deactivate the system, it said coldly. Why? Mara hesitated, her hands tightening around the datapad. We thought the ship was going to seal itself. We were trying to stop it. The entity's expression darkened. That seal is the only thing keeping what lies beneath contained. Reed's eyes narrowed. What lies beneath? The entity paused, scanning each of them in silence. When it finally spoke, its voice carried the weight of something ancient, something that had lingered in the void for far too long. You stand aboard the Aegis Primus, a ship designed not to save lives, but to imprison them. This is not a derelict vessel. It is a tomb, drifting endlessly to keep the prisoners inside from reaching your world. Kane's face paled. Prisoners? You mean those things? He gestured toward the violet-eyed figures. The red-eyed entity shook its head slowly. No, they are the jailers. I am their warden. The revelation hit Reed like a freight train. His mind raced to piece it together. "You're human, aren't you?" The entity's gaze lingered on Reed for a long moment. "I was. A long time ago." Mara's eyes widened. "You were part of the old Earth Defense Fleet. How long have you been here?" "Long enough to forget." Before anyone could speak, the chamber trembled violently. The walls rippled, and the cables that had once lined the ship's interior began retracting rapidly, disappearing into the floor. The violet-eyed jailers suddenly turned their heads toward the walls, their expressions unreadable. The warden's gaze shifted toward the center pod, the one it had emerged from. "They're waking up," the warden said gravely. "You shouldn't have come here." Reed stepped forward. "Then help us stop them. If you're the warden, you can contain whatever's inside." The warden's eyes flared brighter for a brief second, but then dimmed. "I no longer control this ship." The air grew colder. Mara's scanner beeped rapidly. "Captain, I'm detecting movement across the lower decks. Dozens of life signs spreading." Kane cursed under his breath. "I told you opening that console was a bad idea." Mara ignored him, frantically analyzing the readings. "They're converging on the shuttle bay." "Captain, they're coming for us." Reed clenched his fists. "Warden, if you want to keep those things locked up, we need to get off this ship. Can you help us?" The warden's red eyes flickered, but this time with something else: reluctance. "The only way off this ship is through the escape corridor, but it leads directly through the containment sector. If the prisoners have already breached their pods..." Reed finished the sentence for him. "Then we'll have to fight our way through." Kane grunted. "Terrific." "There's more," the warden added. "One of your crew has already been marked." Reed's stomach dropped. He turned sharply toward Mara and Kane, scanning them carefully. Kane frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The warden pointed directly at Mara. Her eyes widened. "Me? I haven't." But as she spoke, the veins on her wrist began to faintly glow, the same violet hue as the jailer's eyes. Reed grabbed Mara's arm, pulling her toward the corridor. "Move." The warden stayed behind, raising both hands as energy coursed through his body. "Go. I will hold them here." Mara hesitated. "But..." "Go." Kane pulled her through the corridor as the containment chamber erupted in light. The warden's red glow faded behind them, swallowed by the advancing prisoners. The escape. They reached the shuttle just as the ship's structure began collapsing. The docking clamps disengaged with a loud hiss as the reactor's overload spread throughout the vessel. Reed threw himself into the pilot's seat, igniting the thrusters. The shuttle burst away from the derelict ship, flames consuming the corridors they had left behind. As they drifted into the cold vacuum of space, Mara stared silently at the burning vessel. The violet glow on her wrist was gone. Reed exhaled in relief. "We're clear." Kane leaned back, closing his eyes. "I never want to do that again." Mara's gaze remained fixed on the ship as it collapsed inward, taking the prisoners, and the warden, with it. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them back. Humanity's stand. Mara stared at her wrist in horror as the faint violet veins pulsed beneath her skin, creeping slowly toward her elbow. Her breaths grew shallow, and her eyes darted between Reed and Kane, searching for answers none of them had. I didn't touch anything," Mara stammered. "I don't feel different." Kane took a cautious step back, gripping his plasma cutter tighter. "Captain, what the hell is that?" The warden's crimson eyes locked onto Mara, his expression impassive. "It is the mark of symbiosis," the warden said calmly, as if reading from a script written long ago. "The ship recognizes her as part of it now. If left unchecked, she will no longer be herself." Mara recoiled, instinctively pulling her sleeve down to cover the mark. "No. I didn't ask for this." Reed stepped between Mara and the warden, his hand raised. "Can you stop it?" The warden's gaze lingered on Reed for a long moment. "Possibly. But the process is irreversible after a certain point. If containment breaches fully, The infection will spread to your station, to your world. Mara's eyes darted to Reed, panic evident. Captain, I can't go back like this. I'm not risking the station. You need to stop this. Now. Reed's fists clenched. His mind raced, but he kept his voice steady. I'm not leaving you behind, Mara. We end this together. Kane exhaled sharply. All right, but we need a plan. And fast. Those things are already moving toward the shuttle bay. The warden finally spoke, stepping closer. The ship's core must be destroyed. It is the source of the symbiosis. If you overload the reactor, the ship will be incinerated, along with everything inside. Mara's eyes widened. The entire ship. That'll kill you too. The warden's expression didn't change. I am already dead. The descent into chaos. The corridors leading to the containment sector twisted unnaturally, as if the ship itself resisted their advance. The violet glow on Mara's wrist pulsed faintly, matching the flickering lights embedded in the ship's walls. As they moved, the faint sounds of metal scraping against the floor echoed from behind. They're following us, Kane growled, glancing back nervously. Keep moving, Reed ordered. The warden led the way, his massive frame barely making a sound as he moved down the corridor. The pale jailers from before followed at a distance, their glowing eyes flickering in the shadows like silent sentinels. Mara's breathing quickened. I feel something. It's like the ship is inside my head. Kane shot her a worried glance. Captain, if she starts hearing voices, I'm voting we space her. Mara scowled. I'm still me, Kane. For now. They reached the containment chamber, a vast, circular room lined with broken pods, their glass shattered from the inside. Strange, spindly shapes crouched in the shadows, their eyes flickering faintly as they stirred. The prisoners. Reed's grip tightened on his weapon. How many are there? The warden's eyes scanned the room. Enough to overrun your station in hours. Mara's hands trembled as she accessed the reactor controls. I can overload the core from here, but the system's heavily encrypted. I need at least 10 minutes. You've got 5, Kane muttered, plasma cutter raised. The first wave. The prisoners stirred, their emaciated bodies moving with unnatural grace as they rose from the shadows. Some crawled along the walls, others skittered across the floor, their jagged limbs twitching. They're coming, Kane said coldly. Reed stepped forward, firing the first shot. The plasma round struck one of the creatures dead center, sending it sprawling backward. It twitched but didn't rise. The rest charged. Kane's plasma cutter roared to life, carving through the creatures as they lunged toward the team. The warden strode calmly forward, raising his hand. A wave of red energy pulsed from his palm, incinerating several prisoners in a single sweep. But more came. Mara, Reed shouted as he fired another shot. How much longer? Almost there. Mara's voice cracked with tension. Sweat dripped down her brow as she frantically bypassed the core's encryption. One of the prisoners leaped toward her, but Kane intercepted it with a sharp blast, sending the creature tumbling back. Containment failing, the warden warned. They will not stop. They exist to consume. Reed gritted his teeth. Then we hold the line. The last stand. The chamber shook violently as the ship's reactor began to overload. Sparks cascaded from the walls, and the violet glow across Mara's wrist began to fade, flickering as if in pain. Core breach in 60 seconds. Mara gasped. Captain, we need to get to the shuttle. Now. The prisoners surged forward, desperate to stop them. Kane emptied his plasma cutter, yelling as he drove them back.